The Sumerian verb isn't the one you'd expect. When ancient scribes described how the Anunnaki came to Earth, they used ursag, which carries connotations of seeking refuge or fleeing to safety, rather than ea, which means to descend with authority or arrive by choice. This linguistic detail, buried in thousands of clay tablets scattered across museum collections, suggests something remarkable. The beings we've been told descended from heaven to colonize Earth might actually have been running from something, seeking sanctuary on a remote planet far from whatever threatened them in the cosmic reaches they'd left behind. Welcome. It's late, I know, and you've come here perhaps seeking not just knowledge but also wondering, a way to see ancient mysteries from an angle that shifts everything you thought you understood. Thank you for being here tonight. What we're about to explore together challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about the Anunnaki narrative, asking not where they came from, but what they were fleeing, not why they came, but what made staying impossible in the realm they'd left. Here's what makes this remarkable. For more than 150 years since George Smith first translated the Akkadian creation epics in the 1870s, scholars have read the Sumerian texts as describing gods who chose to come to Earth, who descended from heaven to establish civilization, who arrived with purpose and power. The standard interpretation treats the Anunnaki as colonizers or visitors, beings who came to mine gold according to Zecharia Sitchin's theories, or as mythological deities, who simply existed as theological constructs in ancient imagination. But careful linguistic analysis of the original Sumerian and Akkadian terms reveals a different vocabulary threading through these narratives. Words suggesting flight, asylum, hiding, and the desperate search for safety that refugees experience when everything familiar collapses behind them. Mainstream Assyriologists remain cautious about reading too much into individual word choices, noting that ancient languages use terms flexibly and that translation always involves interpretation. The texts describe cosmic conflicts, primordial wars among divine beings, and catastrophic events that preceded the establishment of civilization on Earth, but scholars typically treat these as mythological frameworks, explaining cosmic order, rather than historical accounts of actual events. Alternative researchers point to the specificity of the language, the consistent patterns across multiple independent texts, and ask whether ancient scribes might have been preserving genuine memory of beings who fled cosmic catastrophe and established Earth as their refuge, describing events they witnessed or inherited from earlier generations in the only conceptual vocabulary their culture possessed. We're not here to settle that debate tonight. Our purpose isn't to prove the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial refugees, or to dismiss the texts as pure mythology. We're here to explore what happens when we read these ancient words through the lens of escape, rather than arrival. When we ask what the Sumerian and Akkadian languages actually say about why these beings came to Earth, and what evidence exists in the texts themselves for a narrative of flight and refuge that generations of translation may have smoothed into the more familiar story of divine descent and purposeful colonization. Take a breath. Where are you right now? Maybe in bed with darkness gathered around you, or perhaps sitting somewhere quiet with just enough light to feel safe but not disturbed. Let your shoulders settle slightly. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing demanding your attention beyond this slow exploration of what ancient voices might have been trying to tell us about vulnerability, fear, and the universal experience of seeking sanctuary when everything you knew collapses. If this journey speaks to you, a like or subscribe helps others find these explorations into the hidden dimensions of ancient texts. It's a small gesture that matters. Thank you. Now then, picture the night sky above ancient Sumer around 3500 BCE, stars burning with intensity impossible to imagine under modern light pollution. The people who would soon develop writing watched those stars with an attention that bordered on obsession, tracking movements, recording patterns, interpreting every unusual configuration as communication from the gods who supposedly dwelt among those distant lights. But what if that obsessive watching wasn't worship but vigilance? What if the priests climbing ziggurat stairs at midnight were maintaining watch for something the Anunnaki feared might follow them, scanning the heavens not for divine messages but for signs of pursuit? The texts that describe the Anunnaki's coming to Earth contain layers of meaning that shift depending on how we translate key terms, which assumptions we bring to the reading, and whether we're willing to consider that gods might be as vulnerable as humans to forces beyond their control. What were they running from? What made Earth seem like safety despite its primitive conditions? And are they still watching the stars, still afraid that whatever drove them here might someday find them? Let's begin by examining what we've been told about their arrival, before we explore what the language itself suggests about their escape. Open any scholarly text on Mesopotamian mythology, published before 2000, and you'll find the same essential story. The Anunnaki descended from heaven to earth, divine beings choosing to establish presence among humans, gods who came down from the celestial realm called An to organize earthly civilization according to cosmic principles they brought with them. This interpretation has dominated academic understanding since the first cuneiform tablets were translated in the mid-19th century, shaping how generations of scholars, students, and general readers have understood these ancient texts. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic composed around 1200 BCE, describes the universe emerging from primordial waters through divine conflict and organization. Marduk, the Babylonian champion god, defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos from her corpse, establishing order from chaos. The Anunnaki appear in this narrative as witnesses and supporters, divine nobility who observe Marduk's triumph and grant him supremacy through their collective approval. They descend to earth after creation is complete, taking up residence in temples humans build for them, accepting worship and offerings in exchange for maintaining cosmic stability. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE from earlier sources, opens with the phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven." The kingship was in Eridu. This sentence has been interpreted for more than a century as describing divine legitimacy being granted to earthly rulers, kingship as a gift from the gods who came down from celestial heights to establish proper governance among humans. The text lists impossibly long antediluvian reigns before the flood, then resumes with more plausible chronologies, suggesting a transition from mythic to historical time, when divine and human spheres supposedly began separating. Samuel Noah Kramer, whose translations dominated Sumerian studies from the 1940s through 1980s, consistently read the texts as describing intentional divine action. In his influential work The Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, published in 1963, he argued that the gods chose to create humanity, chose to establish civilization, and chose to dwell in temples as the natural order of a well-organized cosmos. This reading treats descent from heaven as purposeful arrival, gods exercising their will to shape earthly reality according to divine plans. When Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976, he challenged academic consensus but maintained the assumption of intentional arrival. His extraterrestrial interpretation positioned the Anunnaki as visitors from the planet Nibiru, who came to Earth specifically to mine gold, genetically engineering humanity as a labor force to serve their material needs. This represented radical departure from mythological interpretation, yet it preserved the core narrative structure, beings from elsewhere, choosing to come here for specific purposes, arriving with clear intentions and superior capabilities. Thorkil Jacobson's theological analysis, published throughout the mid-20th century, treated the descent narrative as sophisticated metaphor, expressing how ancient Mesopotamians understood the relationship between transcendent and immanent aspects of divinity. Gods dwelling in heaven represented cosmic principles, eternal and unchanging. Gods descending to earth and inhabiting temple statues represented those same principles, becoming accessible to human consciousness through ritual and worship. The movement from heaven to earth wasn't literal physical relocation, but theological expression of how the divine manifests in material reality. Archaeological evidence seemed to support the standard narrative. The sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE, with its sophisticated agriculture, monumental architecture, complex social organization, and revolutionary writing system, appeared to vindicate texts describing gods bringing civilization to previously primitive peoples. The rapidity of development suggested external catalyst, whether divine intervention in theological terms or cultural diffusion from unknown advanced source in archaeological interpretation. Imagine standing in the ruins of Eridu around 2900 BCE, the city identified in texts as the first place kingship descended from heaven. The temple complex dedicated to Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, rises approximately 12 meters above the surrounding plain, rebuilt multiple times on the same sacred spot across more than 2,000 years of continuous occupation. Priests perform daily rituals feeding and clothing the divine statue, maintaining the presence they believe connects heaven to earth. The air smells of incense and roasting meat, offerings burning on altars while singers chant hymns describing how Enki descended to establish his dwelling here at the edge of the marshlands. This standard narrative created coherent framework for understanding thousands of cuneiform texts. Gods descended, humans served them, civilization emerged from that relationship, and cosmic order was maintained through proper ritual. The story made sense within both ancient theological contexts and modern anthropological frameworks that see religion as cultural construct explaining natural phenomena and social structures. But coherence doesn't guarantee accuracy. The same texts that seem to clearly describe purposeful divine descent contain other language, other terms, other phrases that suggest different narratives, when examined through linguistic analysis that looks beyond traditional translation choices. The vocabulary of flight exists alongside the vocabulary of descent in these ancient words, and perhaps the scribes who pressed styluses into wet clay were preserving more complex truth than later readers recognized. The stars that supposedly housed the Anunnaki before their descent still wheel overhead, following patterns unchanged across the 5,000 years since Sumerian civilization emerged. Whether gods actually dwelled among those stars, or whether the heavens served simply as convenient metaphor for transcendent origin, the texts describing the Anunnaki's coming to Earth deserve examination that doesn't assume we already know what they mean, that remains open to discovering the language itself, might be telling us something different from what generations of translation have smoothed into familiar narrative about gods choosing to descend and establish civilization among grateful humans. The Sumerian language preserves distinctions that translation into English often obscures. When describing movement from one realm to another, scribes had multiple verbs available, each carrying different connotations about agency, purpose, and circumstance. The verb ea means to descend with authority, to come down deliberately from a position of power. The verb sag carries meanings of seeking refuge, fleeing to safety, or arriving as one escapes danger. Both verbs appear in texts describing the Anunnaki's relationship with Earth, yet traditional translations have typically rendered both as simple descended, smoothing away nuances that might suggest very different narratives. Examination of the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest Sumerian creation narratives dating to approximately 2300 BCE, reveals interesting patterns. The text describes the Anunnaki gathering on Earth rather than simply arriving, using terms that suggest assembly of dispersed groups seeking common location. The word dug appears, which can mean to gather for protection or to congregate when threatened. These aren't the verbs you'd expect for triumphant arrival or purposeful colonization, yet they appear consistently across multiple independent textual traditions. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BCE in Akkadian, uses the term halak when describing how certain divine beings came to be on Earth. This verb primarily means to be lost, to perish, or to disappear, but it also carries secondary meanings of escaping destruction or fleeing catastrophe. Academic translations typically render it as came to be or were created, treating it as neutral statement about divine origins, but the root meaning suggests beings who escaped something, who survived when others didn't, who arrived on Earth not through choice but through desperate flight from extinction. Linguistic analysis conducted by scholars including Bent Alster at the University of Copenhagen and Jeremy Black at Oxford during the 1980s and 1990s noted these terminological patterns, generally interpreted them as poetic variation rather than meaningful distinction. When ancient scribes used multiple terms for similar concepts, mainstream scholarship assumes stylistic choice rather than precise description of different circumstances. This methodological assumption shapes how texts get translated and understood. Consider the phrase that appears in multiple Sumerian hymns, anta-a, traditionally translated as descended from heaven, but the term a carries connotations not just of exiting but of escaping, of departing under duress. A more literal rendering might be escaped from the heights, or fled from the celestial realm. This doesn't definitively prove the Anunnaki were refugees, but it suggests the possibility deserves consideration rather than automatic dismissal. References to the Anunnaki seeking Earth appear in several texts. The verb kin means to seek in the sense of searching for something lost or needed, different from pad, which means to find something you were looking for specifically. The distinction matters because it suggests the Anunnaki might have been searching desperately for any suitable refuge, rather than deliberately targeting Earth as their destination. They found this planet, the language hints, rather than choosing it from among known alternatives. The Sumerian term kisiki appears in temple hymns, describing the Anunnaki's relationship with their earthly dwellings. This compound word combines ki, meaning place or location, with siki, meaning peaceful or safe. Scholars have typically translated this as sacred place or holy dwelling, but the root meaning suggests safe location or peaceful refuge. Temples weren't just houses for gods, but sanctuaries, places of safety where beings vulnerable to cosmic threats could find protection. Akkadian texts from the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE describe the gods as mutlaku, which means wanderers, or those who have been displaced from their homes. The term carries connotations of exile rather than voluntary travel, refugees rather than explorers. When combined with earlier Sumerian terminology suggesting flight and refuge seeking, a pattern emerges across 500 years of textual tradition, hinting that the Anunnaki's arrival on Earth might have been escape from catastrophe rather than purposeful colonization. Perhaps the most telling linguistic evidence comes from astronomical texts. The Mul.Rpn tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE, but preserving much earlier material, use the verb natsaru repeatedly when describing divine relationship with celestial observation. This verb means to watch, but specifically to watch for danger, to keep guard, to maintain vigilance against threats. The gods weren't simply observing the heavens for calendrical or omen purposes in these texts. They were watching for something specific, maintaining defensive awareness, keeping guard against whatever might approach from the cosmic distances they'd fled. Translation is never neutral. Every choice about which English word to use for a Sumerian or Akkadian term reflects assumptions about what the text means, what the ancient authors intended, and what seems plausible to modern translators. When translators assumed the Anunnaki were powerful gods choosing to descend, they selected English words conveying authority and intention. When we allow for the possibility they were refugees fleeing cosmic catastrophe, different English words suddenly seem more appropriate for the same ancient terms. The texts themselves remain unchanged, waiting in museum collections and archaeological archives. The same cuneiform marks pressed into clay 4,000 years ago can be read multiple ways depending on which linguistic possibilities we're willing to consider. And buried in that ancient vocabulary, preserved through millennia of copying and recopying, may lie evidence that the beings who established Mesopotamian civilization came to Earth not as conquerors or visitors, but as refugees seeking the one thing all displaced peoples desperately need: a safe place to hide from whatever catastrophe had destroyed the world they'd left behind. The texts don't describe heaven as paradise. When Sumerian and Akkadian scribes wrote about the celestial realm the Anunnaki departed from, they described a place of conflict, instability, and catastrophic violence that makes their flight to Earth seem less like colonization and more like desperate escape from uninhabitable conditions. The Enuma Elish opens not with peaceful cosmic order, but with primordial chaos. Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, mingle their waters in the beginning, and from this mixture the first gods emerge. But the narrative immediately turns violent. The younger gods make noise that disturbs Apsu's rest, and he decides to destroy them completely. Enki kills Apsu first, establishing his dwelling over the murdered primordial father's body. Tiamat responds by creating an army of monsters, leading to the cosmic war that dominates the epic's central sections. This wasn't the stable heaven of later theological imagination. The realm the gods inhabited before establishing presence on Earth was consumed by existential conflict, with creation itself emerging from violence and murder among divine beings. Marduk's victory over Tiamat creates the cosmos we inhabit, but it's built literally from a corpse, fashioned from a defeated enemy, established through force rather than harmony. The Atrahasis epic describes different but equally unsettling conditions in the divine realm before humanity's creation. The Igigi, lesser gods, perform endless labor maintaining cosmic infrastructure, digging canals and rivers in the celestial regions for 40 years until they finally rebel. They burn their tools, march on Enlil's residence, and refuse to continue the work that sustains divine civilization. This rebellion creates the crisis that leads to humanity's creation, but it also reveals that even in their original realm, the gods faced resource constraints, labor shortages, and social tensions severe enough to trigger revolt. Long before the Anunnaki established themselves on Earth, they inhabited realms characterized by scarcity rather than abundance, by conflict rather than peace, and by catastrophic violence that repeatedly threatened existence itself. The text describe multiple wars in heaven, not a single primordial conflict, but recurring patterns of cosmic violence that suggest the celestial realm was fundamentally unstable. References to older gods appear throughout Mesopotamian literature, beings who existed before the Anunnaki, and who apparently posed serious threats. The seven sages, or Apkallu, come from before the flood, described as having brought civilization to humanity, but also as fleeing from destroyed previous realms. Some texts hint these beings weren't native to the celestial realm the Anunnaki inhabited, but refugees from even earlier catastrophes, suggesting patterns of flight and resettlement extending back through multiple cosmic ages. Environmental catastrophe appears in descriptions of the pre-terrestrial divine realm. Texts mention the darkening of heaven, cosmic winds that scoured divine dwellings, and celestial fires that consumed entire regions of the upper world. These descriptions might be purely mythological, metaphors for theological concepts about cosmic order and disorder, or they might preserve distorted memories of actual environmental collapse in whatever realm the Anunnaki originated from, catastrophic events that made continued habitation impossible. Perhaps the most suggestive evidence comes from texts describing why Marduk's victory over Tiamat was so desperately important. After defeating her, he doesn't just claim supremacy, he creates stable cosmos from her body, establishing fixed celestial mechanics, reliable seasonal cycles, and predictable astronomical patterns. This suggests the previous condition was unstable, unpredictable, dangerous. The gods needed Earth as stable platform because their previous realm had become chaotic, unreliable, ultimately uninhabitable. Astronomical references in these creation narratives take on different meaning when read as describing actual cosmic catastrophe rather than pure mythology. The celestial battles might preserve memories of asteroid impacts, planetary disruptions, or stellar events that devastated previously habitable regions of space. When Marduk divides Tiamat's body to create heaven and earth, establishing the vault of sky and solid ground below, this might describe refugees from cosmic catastrophe, establishing themselves on a terrestrial planet after their previous home, perhaps in space itself or on another world, was destroyed. The gods' fear during the flood in the Atrahasis epic reveals vulnerability inconsistent with the image of powerful beings choosing to visit primitive Earth. The text describes them cowering like dogs, terrified by the deluge, climbing to the highest heaven to escape rising waters. This disproportionate reaction makes more sense if they were refugees who'd already fled one catastrophe and feared another had followed them to Earth. Their terror wasn't just concern for humanity, but existential dread that they might have to flee again, that Earth might prove no safer than the realm they'd abandoned. We may never know what cosmic events the texts attempt to describe through mythological language. The war in heaven might reference actual conflict among spacefaring civilizations, or planetary catastrophe that forced evacuation, or stellar events that rendered previous habitats uninhabitable, or it might be purely theological construction, sophisticated mythology created to explain cosmic order without preserving any historical memory of actual events. What remains clear from the texts themselves is that the realm the Anunnaki departed from was characterized by violence, instability, and catastrophic threat. They didn't leave paradise to visit primitive Earth. They fled catastrophe to seek refuge on a remote planet that offered what their previous home apparently couldn't: safety, stability, and the possibility of survival, when everything familiar had collapsed into chaos behind them. And if that reading holds truth, then every temple they built, every astronomical observation they conducted, every defensive wall they erected, might have served purposes beyond what conventional interpretation suggests. Infrastructure, not for colonization, but for hiding from whatever cosmic catastrophe had driven them to seek sanctuary among the stars. The earliest Sumerian text describing the Anunnaki's coming to Earth survives in fragments. The Eridu Genesis, composed sometime before 2000 BCE, but likely preserving much older oral traditions, opens with a description of the world when the names of mankind had not been pronounced. In this primordial time before human civilization, the text describes how the Anunnaki were not manifest, using a term that suggests they were hiding or concealed rather than simply absent. The verb translated as manifest is do, which carries multiple meanings in Sumerian. It can mean to appear or to become visible, but it also means to emerge from hiding or to stop concealing oneself. This linguistic choice suggests the Anunnaki were already present but hidden, waiting before revealing themselves, a pattern more consistent with refugees establishing secure position before making contact than with powerful visitors announcing their arrival. When the text describes kingship being lowered from heaven, the Sumerian phrase uses abtar ar rather than the expected antar ar. The difference matters because ab refers to depths or underground rather than heights, suggesting kingship emerged from hidden depths rather than descending from celestial heights. Some scholars argue this represents scribal error or poetic variation, but the phrase appears consistently across multiple manuscript copies, suggesting intentional word choice. References to the Anunnaki seeking locations appear throughout early Sumerian literature. The Barton cylinder, dated to approximately 2400 BCE, describes how the gods searched the land before establishing temples, using verbs that suggest desperation rather than casual surveying. They weren't selecting optimal sites from position of power, but frantically seeking locations that met specific requirements, possibly defensibility or concealment from whatever they'd fled. Archaeological evidence from the earliest Sumerian settlements reveals patterns consistent with refugee populations. The Ubaid period, roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, shows scattered small villages without apparent central organization. Then around 4000 BCE, settlement patterns suddenly change, with populations concentrating in specific locations that would become the first cities. This aggregation suggests external catalyst bringing dispersed groups together, similar to how refugee populations establish camps in locations offering safety and resources. Eridu, identified in texts as the first city where kingship descended, shows continuous occupation from approximately 5400 BCE. Excavations revealed 18 successive temple levels at the main complex, each rebuilt directly atop its predecessor on precisely the same sacred spot. This remarkable continuity suggests the location held significance beyond practical considerations, perhaps marking the exact place where the Anunnaki first established permanent settlement after arrival. The temple at Eridu's lowest levels, dating to the late Ubaid period around 5000 BCE, measures only 3 by 4 meters, a modest structure barely large enough for a single room. This humble beginning seems inconsistent with powerful gods arriving to establish civilization. It appears more like desperate refugees constructing minimal shelter, establishing initial foothold before expanding as resources and security permitted. Texts describe Earth as being found by the Anunnaki rather than chosen or conquered. The Sumerian word pad appears in several early compositions, meaning to discover something you weren't necessarily searching for specifically. This suggests they located Earth through searching, rather than targeting it from knowledge of its existence, refugees scanning cosmic distances for any habitable refuge, rather than colonizers selecting optimal target from surveyed alternatives. Perhaps most telling are references to Earth's remoteness. Several texts describe it as being at the edge or in the corner, using spatial language suggesting distance from centers of cosmic activity. For colonizers, remoteness would be disadvantage. For refugees seeking to hide from pursuit, remoteness represents primary advantage, distance from whatever catastrophe they'd fled. The timing of Sumerian civilization's emergence correlates with dramatic climate shifts in Mesopotamia. Around 5000 BCE, the Persian Gulf coastline lay approximately 150 kilometers further south than its current position, creating extensive marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates. These wetlands would have provided natural concealment, abundant resources, and defensive barriers against land-based threats, ideal conditions for refugee population establishing hidden settlement. What the texts call the age when the gods first came to the land appears archaeologically as the Ubaid period's transition to the Uruk period around 4000 BCE. This transformation shows rapid development of urban centers, monumental architecture, complex social organization, and revolutionary writing systems. The speed of change has puzzled archaeologists for decades, seeming too rapid for purely indigenous development, yet showing no clear evidence of migration from other known human populations. If the Anunnaki were refugees arriving on Earth during the late Ubaid period, their knowledge and technologies would have catalyzed exactly the kind of rapid cultural transformation the archaeological record shows. They wouldn't have arrived as conquerors imposing their will, but as desperate survivors sharing knowledge with indigenous populations in exchange for shelter, labor, and integration into communities that could help conceal their presence from whatever cosmic threats they feared. The stars those early Sumerians watched with such obsessive attention still wheel overhead, following the same paths they traced when the first cities rose from the marshlands between two rivers. Whether gods actually sought refuge among those stars, or whether the entire narrative represents sophisticated mythology encoding cultural memory of actual migration events, the texts describing the Anunnaki's relationship with Earth consistently use language suggesting flight, refuge-seeking, and desperate arrival rather than purposeful descent and organized colonization. The flood appears in Mesopotamian texts, not as single catastrophic event, but as recurring trauma, described in at least 5 major compositions spanning more than 1,000 years. The obsessive repetition suggests the deluge held significance beyond typical mythological disaster, perhaps representing moment when whatever the Anunnaki had fled from nearly followed them to Earth, when their refuge was almost destroyed by the same catastrophic forces that had devastated their previous realm. The Eridu Genesis, the earliest flood narrative, describes the gods' decision to destroy humanity through deluge, but it also contains strange details about divine fear during the event. The text mentions that the Anunnaki shook like trees in a storm as the waters rose, an odd phrase suggesting terror inappropriate for beings supposedly controlling the catastrophe. Their fear seems disproportionate unless the flood represented existential threat to them as well as to humanity. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BCE, provides the most detailed account of divine behavior during the deluge. The text describes how the Anunnaki cowered like dogs and crouched against the outer wall as waters rose, fleeing to the highest heaven to escape the inundation. The goddess Belatili cries out, "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I order battle to destroy my people?" Her lament suggests the flood wasn't divine punishment they'd chosen, but catastrophe forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. Enlil's role in the flood narrative takes on different meaning when read through the refugee interpretation. Traditional scholarship treats him as angry god punishing humanity for noise and overpopulation, but the text describes him as being terrified during the actual flood, hardly consistent with deity implementing his own chosen punishment. One interpretation suggests Enlil recognized signs that the catastrophic forces they'd fled were approaching Earth, and ordered the flood as desperate attempt to eliminate all evidence of their presence, destroying the human civilization that might attract unwanted attention. Enki's subversion of the flood plan, warning Atrahasis to build a boat and preserve life, appears in this context as refugee, choosing preservation over concealment. Rather than divine compassion, his actions might represent pragmatic recognition that destroying humanity would leave the Anunnaki without the indigenous population they'd integrated with for protection and camouflage. The gods needed humans, not just for labor, but as cover, making their small refugee population invisible within larger human civilization. The specific instructions for the boat reveal sophisticated knowledge inconsistent with Bronze Age technology. The text specifies dimensions, waterproofing methods, using bitumen applied in specific thicknesses, compartmentalization of interior spaces, and loading procedures designed to maximize survival. These details suggest engineering expertise the Anunnaki brought from their previous realm, knowledge they'd used before when fleeing catastrophe, now shared with humans to preserve life during another disaster. Geological evidence documents massive flooding in Mesopotamia, around 2900 BCE, with sediment layers at Uruk and Shuruppak, showing sterile clay deposits approximately 60 centimeters thick, separating pre-flood from post-flood occupation layers. The flood was real, though localized to the Mesopotamian plain rather than global, but its severity and the trauma it inflicted on early Sumerian civilization preserved it in cultural memory for millennia. What caused the flood remains debated among climate scientists and archaeologists. Some evidence points to rapid glacial melting at the end of the Younger Dryas period, creating catastrophic sea level rise that would have inundated coastal settlements. Other research suggests massive rainfall events triggered by volcanic eruptions affecting atmospheric patterns, but the Mesopotamian texts hint at another possibility, that the flood resulted from the same cosmic forces that had destroyed the Anunnaki's previous home. References to waters from above appearing in several flood narratives might describe precipitation, or they might preserve memory of cometary impacts or celestial water delivery mechanisms. The phrase "windows of heaven opened" appears in both Mesopotamian and biblical flood accounts, suggesting water came from cosmic rather than purely terrestrial sources. If the Anunnaki had fled cosmic catastrophe involving water or ice, encountering similar disaster on Earth would have triggered the terror the texts describe. The Apikalu, 7 sages who brought civilization before the flood, are described as having buried the writings at Sippar before the deluge, preserving essential knowledge for recovery afterward. This detail suggests they anticipated the catastrophe, that they'd seen similar disasters before, that they knew from experience to preserve core knowledge in protected locations for survivors to rediscover. The buried texts at Sippar were supposedly recovered after the flood, providing technological and astronomical knowledge that allowed civilization to rebuild. After the flood, the texts describe the gods as gathering like flies around Atrahasis' sacrifice, desperately hungry because they'd been without offerings during the disaster. This image of divine desperation, of beings dependent on human provision, contradicts the powerful god archetype, but perfectly matches refugee population dependent on indigenous communities for survival. Without humans producing food and performing rituals, the Anunnaki apparently couldn't sustain themselves, revealing vulnerability inconsistent with colonizer narratives, but expected for refugees. Perhaps the most haunting detail appears in the final sections of the Atrahasis epic. After the flood recedes, Enlil doesn't punish Enki for subverting the plan, but instead accepts that humanity will continue, instituting new measures to control population through disease, infertility, and celibate priestesses. This compromise suggests the flood was an attempt to address a specific threat that partially failed, requiring alternative strategies to ensure the Anunnaki remained hidden within, but not overwhelmed by the human populations they'd established as camouflage. The stars that witnessed the flood, if it occurred, still track their ancient paths across the night sky. Whether the deluge represented purely natural disaster, amplified through mythological memory, or actual cosmic catastrophe following the Anunnaki to their earthly refuge, the texts preserve evidence that these beings experienced the flood not as punishment they controlled, but as terror they endured, vulnerability that exposed them as refugees still fleeing from forces they couldn't escape completely, even on this remote planet they'd found and desperately hoped would prove safe enough for survival. George Smith was 32 years old in November 1872, working as an assistant in the British Museum's Department of Oriental Antiquities, when he began examining fragments from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. Trained as an engraver with no formal education in ancient languages, Smith had taught himself cuneiform through obsessive study during lunch breaks, and after closing hours, gradually becoming proficient enough that the museum hired him to help catalogue the thousands of tablets arriving from Mesopotamian excavation sites. The reading room where Smith worked received natural light through tall windows facing Great Russell Street, illumination that shifted across wooden tables as the day progressed. On this particular November afternoon, Smith was sorting through fragments from the 7th century BCE Assyrian royal library, trying to match broken pieces and identify which tablets might be worth priority translation. He picked up a piece measuring approximately 15 by 11 centimeters, covered in neat cuneiform script, and began reading the Akkadian text, describing a great flood that destroyed the world, while one righteous man survived by building a boat and preserving animals. The similarity to the biblical narrative was immediately obvious. Smith later wrote that he jumped up and rushed about the room in a great state of excitement, and, to the astonishment of those present, began to undress himself. The exact details of his reaction have been embellished over time, but witnesses confirmed he became highly agitated. Recognizing that he'd discovered Mesopotamian parallels to Genesis that predated the Hebrew scriptures by more than 1,000 years, the tablet was Tablet 11 of what would become known as the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, containing Utnapishtim's account of the flood. Within weeks, Smith published preliminary translation, creating international sensation. The Daily Telegraph offered 1,000 guineas to fund an expedition to Nineveh to search for missing portions of the text, an extraordinary sum reflecting public fascination with the discovery. But Smith's initial excitement focused on the biblical parallels rather than the strange details about divine behavior during the flood. His translation noted that the gods cowered like dogs and fled to the highest heaven, but Victorian scholarship interpreted these details as poetic exaggeration or anthropomorphic projection. The possibility that the text might be describing genuine fear, experienced by vulnerable beings rather than mythological metaphor, didn't receive serious consideration. The decades following Smith's discovery brought thousands more tablets to European museums. Austin Henry Laird's excavations at Nineveh, beginning in 1845, had shipped more than 20,000 cuneiform fragments to the British Museum. Leonard Woolley's work at in the 1920s and 1930s produced additional flood narratives and king lists. French excavations at Lagash and Girsu recovered Sumerian texts predating the Akkadian materials, pushing the textual record back another 1,000 years. Translation evolved slowly as scholars gained deeper understanding of Sumerian and Akkadian grammar, syntax and vocabulary. Samuel Noah Kramer's work in the mid-20th century established much of our current understanding of Sumerian literature, publishing translations of creation myths, flood narratives, and royal inscriptions. His interpretations shaped how subsequent generations read the texts, establishing scholarly consensus that remains largely unchanged today. Modern computer-assisted analysis has revealed patterns previous scholars missed. Digital databases containing hundreds of thousands of cuneiform texts allow researchers to track specific words across multiple contexts, revealing nuances that escape notice when examining individual tablets in isolation. This technology enabled the linguistic analysis, suggesting flight and refuge terminology that traditional translation rendered as simple descent from heaven. Approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets remain in the British Museum's collection, with significant portions still unpublished or incompletely studied. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds thousands more, some excavated decades ago but never fully translated, others discovered in recent years despite ongoing political instability in the region. Each year brings new editions of ancient texts, revised interpretations of familiar narratives, and occasionally genuine discoveries that change understanding. The Schoyen Collection, a private Norwegian assemblage of approximately 13,000 cuneiform tablets, includes materials from the early dynastic period through the late Babylonian period. Some of these texts have only been published within the past 2 decades, revealing details about early Sumerian cosmology and divine genealogies that weren't available to earlier scholars. The collection remains controversial because many tablets were acquired through antiquities markets without secure archaeological provenance, but the texts themselves provide valuable evidence regardless of their problematic origins. What George Smith discovered in 1872 was just the beginning of recovering Mesopotamian literature. The texts continue emerging from museum storage, from archaeological excavations, and occasionally from the antiquities market, where looted materials surface, despite international efforts to prevent trafficking. Each new tablet potentially adds detail to our understanding of how ancient Mesopotamians conceived the Anunnaki. whether the linguistic patterns suggesting flight and refuge appear in previously unknown compositions, and whether the standard narrative of divine descent from heaven accurately represents what the texts actually say. The clay tablets themselves remain remarkably durable. Baked by ancient fires or simply dried in desert sun, they've survived 4,000 years in better condition than most materials from comparable antiquity. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay by Sumerian and Akkadian scribes remain as legible today as when they were new, waiting for translators willing to look beyond conventional interpretations and ask whether the language itself might be preserving truths that generations of scholarship have overlooked in their assumption that gods who descended from heaven must have arrived rather than escaped. The primordial war wasn't a single battle. Mesopotamian texts describe recurring conflicts among divine beings that preceded the establishment of order on Earth, suggesting the cosmic realm the Anunnaki inhabited experienced chronic instability rather than temporary crisis. The Enuma Elish frames these conflicts as creation mythology, but buried within the theological structure lie hints of actual catastrophic events that might have forced divine evacuation. Tiamat and Apsu represent more than abstract principles of salt and fresh water. The texts describe them as beings of immense power who posed existential threats to younger gods, entities so dangerous that confronting them required extraordinary measures and weapons. Marduk arms himself with bow, mace, net, and 7 winds before facing Tiamat, suggesting adversary requiring specialized equipment rather than simple divine will. The battle's outcome wasn't certain, and Tiamat's defeat came through strategy rather than overwhelming power. What could threaten beings we conceptualize as gods? If the Anunnaki were advanced extraterrestrial civilization rather than supernatural entities, they'd still be vulnerable to cosmic forces beyond their control. Stellar events like supernovae or gamma-ray bursts could render entire star systems uninhabitable. Planetary catastrophes including massive impacts or magnetic field collapse could destroy worlds. Warfare using advanced weapons might devastate civilizations as thoroughly as any natural disaster. The texts describe Tiamat creating an army of monsters before the final battle. Creatures unlike the younger gods, beings specifically designed for destruction. This detail suggests technological or biological weapons deployment, adversary creating specialized forces to counter the Anunnaki's capabilities. The 11 monster types mentioned in the Enuma Elish might represent different weapon systems or troop classifications rather than mythological creatures, preserved in the only vocabulary ancient scribes possessed to describe technologies they didn't understand. References to environmental destruction in the divine realm appear across multiple texts. The darkening of heaven mentioned in several compositions might describe ash clouds from volcanic activity, or debris fields from planetary fragmentation, or artificial obscuration from warfare's aftermath. The cosmic winds that scoured divine dwellings could represent radiation, or atmospheric stripping, or any number of processes that would make previously habitable locations lethal to organic life. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that the Anunnaki were fleeing other Anunnaki. Internal conflicts among advanced civilizations can be more destructive than natural disasters, civil wars that fragment societies and force refugee populations to seek sanctuary beyond reach of their enemies. The texts mention different factions among divine beings, tensions between older and younger gods, rebellions and counter-rebellions that might reflect genuine political fragmentation rather than mythological allegory. The Agigi rebellion described in the Atrahasis epic takes on different meaning when read as refugee population dynamics. The lesser gods who labored for 40 years before revolting might represent different waves of refugees, with earlier arrivals establishing themselves and later arrivals forced into subordinate positions. Their refusal to continue working could reflect tensions common in refugee camps, where hierarchies from the original homeland break down under pressure of displacement and scarcity. Cosmic catastrophism, the theory that Earth periodically experiences impacts from comets or asteroids, provides possible framework for understanding what the Anunnaki might have fled. Evidence exists for major impact events around 12,900 years ago, and possibly again around 11,600 years ago, catastrophes that would have appeared in human mythology as divine conflicts or cosmic disasters. If the Anunnaki came from elsewhere in our solar system, witnessing such impacts might have motivated their search for more stable refuge. Imagine being part of an advanced civilization watching your world die, the star you orbited becoming unstable, your planet's magnetic field collapsing, or warfare destroying the infrastructure supporting billions of lives. You'd gather whatever technology could be salvaged, assemble whatever population could be evacuated, and search desperately for any location offering survival. Earth, remote and primitive, might seem unappealing under normal circumstances, but represent precious sanctuary when the alternative is extinction. The stars that witnessed whatever catastrophe drove the Anunnaki to Earth still burn in the night sky, though perhaps not the same stars they fled from. If they came from elsewhere in our galaxy, the stellar neighborhood they departed might be visible from Earth, anonymous points of light among thousands that Mesopotamian astronomers catalogued without knowing. One might have been the sun, around which their god's civilization once flourished and died. We may never know what specific threat forced their flight, but the texts preserve consistent pattern of beings fleeing catastrophe, seeking refuge, and attempting to establish hidden sanctuary far from whatever cosmic violence had destroyed the world they'd left behind. Earth offered advantages for refugees that powerful colonizers wouldn't value. Remote from major stellar formations, orbiting an unremarkable G-type star in the outer regions of a spiral arm, this planet would have seemed insignificant to any civilization surveying the galaxy for resources or strategic positions. But for beings seeking to hide from cosmic catastrophe or pursuit, remoteness represents primary asset, distance from whatever catastrophe they'd fled. The presence of indigenous intelligent life, though primitive by Anunnaki standards, provided camouflage. Refugees integrating with local populations become difficult to detect from distance, their presence masked within the electromagnetic and biological signatures of the native civilization. This explains why the texts describe the Anunnaki teaching humanity rather than simply conquering, why they shared knowledge and technologies that elevated human capabilities rather than maintaining strict separation. Defensive considerations appear in how early Sumerian cities were positioned. Eridu sits at the edge of marshlands that would have provided natural barriers against land-based approach, while offering multiple escape routes through waterways. Uruk's location on slightly elevated ground gave visual command of surrounding plains, early warning of any approaching threats. These aren't random settlement choices, but strategic positioning consistent with defensive planning. The ziggurat architecture that dominates Mesopotamian cities from 3000 BCE onward serves functions beyond religious ceremony, rising 30 to 40 meters above surrounding plains. These structures provide observation platforms with visibility extending 15 to 20 kilometers in clear conditions. The astronomical observations conducted from ziggurat summits allowed precise tracking of any unusual celestial phenomena, maintaining watch for signs that whatever the Anunnaki had fled might be approaching Earth. Temple complexes incorporated underground chambers and passages that archaeological excavations reveal, but whose purposes remain debated. The subterranean rooms at Eridu, reaching depths of 4 to 5 meters below the temple platform, were traditionally interpreted as storage or ritual spaces, but their construction required enormous labor investment for relatively small enclosed volumes, suggesting they served more critical functions, possibly as shelters or hiding places where refugees could retreat if discovered. Ur-Enlil served as chief scribe at the Temple of Inanna in Uruk, around 2900 BCE, responsible for maintaining the astronomical records that priests consulted daily. His position required him to climb the ziggurat stairs each evening as the sun set, carrying clay tablets, stylus, and reed baskets containing calculation stones. The climb took approximately 10 minutes. Stone steps worn smooth by centuries of priestly feet ascending to the summit platform. At the top, roughly 35 meters above the city, the air felt cooler and cleaner, carrying scents of river water and distant grasslands, rather than the smoke and food odors that characterized the crowded streets below. Ur-Enlil would set his materials on a stone table, orient himself to cardinal directions using markers embedded in the platform's edges, and begin systematic observations of the night sky. He tracked Venus's position relative to reference stars, noting variations from predicted locations that his tablet specified. He measured the angle of the moon above the horizon using a calibrated wooden staff approximately 2 meters long. Most importantly, he watched for anything unusual, any lights moving in unexpected patterns, any phenomena his training hadn't prepared him to interpret, marking such observations in a special section of tablets stored separately from routine astronomical records. By dawn, Ur-Enlil would have completed a full night's watch, descended the ziggurat stairs as the city awakened below him, and delivered his observations to senior priests who would compare them against patterns tracked across generations, searching for signs that the dangers the Anunnaki supposedly fled might manifest in the heavens they so carefully monitored. The integration between refugee gods and indigenous humans appears in how texts describe the creation of civilization. The Anunnaki didn't impose their culture wholesale, but adapted technologies and knowledge to human capabilities, teaching what could be absorbed and used rather than overwhelming populations with incomprehensible advanced systems. This gradual transfer suggests long-term planning, refugees establishing permanent settlement rather than temporary base. Marriage between gods and humans appears in multiple texts, creating hybrid lineages that blurred boundaries between divine and human populations. The Sumerian king list mentions rulers who were two-thirds god, suggesting systematic interbreeding rather than occasional unions. This mixing would have been strategic for refugees, creating genealogical connections that bound them to indigenous communities and made their presence seem natural rather than alien. The creation of humanity as described in the Atrahasis epic takes on different meaning when read through the sanctuary interpretation. Rather than making slaves for labor, the Anunnaki might have been genetically modifying indigenous hominids to create populations capable of supporting refugee civilization. Humans intelligent enough to farm, build, and maintain infrastructure, but not advanced enough to pose threats or ask uncomfortable questions about their divine teacher's origins. Perhaps most revealing is how texts describe Earth's value to the gods. Several compositions mention the planet as peaceful or quiet, using terms that emphasize its remoteness from cosmic activity rather than its resources or strategic position. For colonizers, peace is luxury. For refugees, peace is necessity, the fundamental requirement without which survival becomes impossible regardless of other advantages. The stars the Anunnaki watched from their ziggurat platforms still wheel overhead, marking the same celestial patterns they observed 5,000 years ago, when they supposedly maintained vigilant watch for threats from the cosmic distances they'd fled. Whether they were actually watching for pursuit or simply tracking astronomical phenomena for calendrical purposes, the obsessive attention they paid to the heavens suggests beings for whom the sky represented not mystery but potential danger, distance that might protect them or might eventually be crossed by whatever catastrophic forces had driven them to seek sanctuary on this remote world they'd found and desperately hoped would prove safe enough for permanent settlement. The divine hierarchy described in Mesopotamian texts mirrors social structures we'd expect in refugee populations. Upper-tier gods like An, Enlil, and Enki occupy leadership positions, making decisions and allocating resources. The Anunnaki serve as administrators and judges, middle management maintaining order. Below them labor the Igigi, lesser gods who perform the physical work sustaining divine civilization until they finally rebel against conditions they find intolerable. The Atrahasis epic describes the Igigi's 40 years of labor with remarkable specificity. They dig the Tigris River to a depth of 180 cubits, approximately 90 meters, an extraordinary excavation requiring sophisticated engineering beyond Bronze Age human capabilities. They construct canals extending for hundreds of kilometers, creating irrigation infrastructure that would support Sumerian agriculture for millennia. This wasn't random labor but systematic landscape modification, terraforming to make Earth habitable for beings accustomed to different environmental conditions. When the Igigi finally rebel, they don't simply stop working. The text describes them burning their tools, marching on Enlil's residence, and demanding relief from conditions that have become unbearable. This organized collective action suggests political consciousness, workers recognizing their oppression and acting together to force change. The rebellion succeeds not through violence but through threat of system collapse, the upper-tier gods realizing their civilization can't function without the labor the Igigi provide. Understanding this conflict as refugee population dynamics, rather than mythological allegory, reveals different patterns. The Igigi might represent later waves of refugees who arrived after the Anunnaki had already established themselves on Earth, forced into subordinate positions by those who got there first. Or they might be the same population, with social stratification emerging through adaptation to Earth's conditions, some individuals thriving while others struggled. The solution to the rebellion, creating humanity to replace divine labor, represents extraordinary intervention in Earth's natural evolution. The texts describe mixing clay with divine blood, using Belit Eli's birth goddess capabilities to fashion beings capable of sustaining civilization the Igigi refused to maintain. This genetic engineering created populations that served dual purposes, providing labor the refugees needed, while also camouflaging their presence within larger indigenous communities. Texts distinguish carefully between different classes of divine beings, using terminology that suggests genuine differences rather than poetic variation. The Anunnaki number 50 according to most lists, a specific count suggesting actual population rather than mythological abstraction. The Igigi are described as more numerous but less powerful, workers rather than decision-makers. These distinctions make sense for refugee population with limited numbers and resources, every individual's role carefully defined to maximize group survival. Archaeological evidence from early dynastic Mesopotamia shows labor organization consistent with these textual descriptions. Large-scale construction projects required coordinating thousands of workers, managing resources, and maintaining records documenting contributions and rations. The temple institutions that dominated Sumerian economy employed craftsmen, farmers, fishermen, weavers, and countless other specialists in hierarchical systems that texts attribute to divine organization, but which functioned through entirely human labor. Perhaps the most interesting detail in the Igigi rebellion narrative is what it reveals about divine limitations. The gods can't simply create more workers through divine will, they can't perform the labor themselves indefinitely, and they can't survive without the infrastructure the labor maintains. These vulnerabilities contradict omnipotent deity archetypes, but perfectly match refugee population, dependent on maintaining technological systems and agricultural production in an environment not originally designed for their species. The creation of humanity, solving the divine labor crisis, suggests the Anunnaki possessed genetic engineering capabilities but couldn't simply manufacture workers from nothing. They needed biological templates, indigenous hominid populations to modify, existing evolutionary development to build upon. This limitation indicates they were working within natural law rather than transcending it. Refugees using advanced technology rather than supernatural beings operating through magic. Relations between the Anunnaki and the Igigi apparently remained tense even after humanity's creation relieved the immediate labor crisis. Several texts mention conflicts among divine ranks, disputes over resource allocation, and complaints about working conditions that suggest the fundamental tensions driving the original rebellion never fully resolved. Refugee populations often experience similar ongoing conflicts, early arrival groups, and later waves competing for limited resources and status within constrained circumstances. Some scholars argue the entire divine hierarchy represents Mesopotamian society projected onto cosmic scale, human class structures reflected in mythological framework. Temple administrators become gods, workers become lesser divine beings, and the whole system functions as ideological justification for earthly inequality. This interpretation has merit, but it doesn't explain the specific details about labor, rebellion, and genetic engineering that thread through multiple independent textual traditions. What if both interpretations hold partial truth? The texts preserve memory of actual refugee population dynamics, social conflicts that emerged when the Anunnaki established themselves on Earth. Later Mesopotamian societies then reproduced those structures, creating human hierarchies that mirrored the divine organization described in increasingly ancient texts. The myths would contain both historical memory and ongoing social commentary, past and present intertwined in ways that make separating them nearly impossible. The stars witness all hierarchies, divine and human, refugee and native, watching impartially as beings organize themselves according to patterns that recur across cultures and species. Whether the Igigi were literally lesser gods, laboring under Anunnaki authority, or mythological projections of human class consciousness, the stories about their rebellion and the creation of humanity to replace their labor preserve insights about vulnerability, dependency, and the desperation that drives both individual and collective action when survival demands change, that those in power resist until crisis forces their hand. The architectural decisions that defined Mesopotamian civilization might have served defensive purposes. Scholars have overlooked temple complexes weren't simply religious structures, but fortified compounds with walls reaching 4 to 6 meters in thickness, far exceeding what's necessary for supporting roof loads or providing symbolic boundary. These massive walls could withstand siege, creating secure refuges where valuable populations and technologies could be protected during crisis. Underground chambers beneath major temples extend to depths of 6 to 8 meters in some locations, requiring enormous labor investment for spaces that conventional interpretation treats as storage or ritual chambers. The Abzu at Eridu, Enki's subterranean dwelling, consisted of interconnected rooms carved into bedrock and lined with baked brick, creating environment protected from surface conditions and invisible to aerial observation. For refugees maintaining technologies requiring specific environmental conditions or hiding from threats that might scan from above, such underground facilities would be essential infrastructure. The ziggurats served multiple functions beyond the astronomical observation platform we've already discussed. These structures, rising 30 to 50 meters above surrounding terrain, provided communication advantages in pre-electronic age. Visual signals using mirrors, fires, or flags could be seen from 20 kilometers or more in clear conditions, allowing rapid information transmission across networks of cities. This communication capability would be critical for refugee population needing to coordinate responses to approaching threats. Defensive positioning of cities suggests strategic planning beyond economic or agricultural considerations. Afra sits on slightly elevated ground with clear sightlines in all directions, impossible to approach unseen. Uruk's location provides similar advantages, while also offering multiple escape routes through the surrounding marshlands. Lagash occupies position where several watercourses converge, creating natural moats that would slow any ground-based attack while providing transportation corridors for evacuation if necessary. The me that appear throughout Mesopotamian texts as divine powers or principles might represent technologies the Anunnaki brought from their previous realm. Lists enumerate more than 100 me, including kingship, priesthood, music, metalworking, and abstract concepts like truth and falsehood. Mainstream interpretation treats these as cultural or religious categories, but the texts describe them as transferable objects that can be stolen, moved between cities, and activated or deactivated, suggesting technological artifacts rather than abstract principles. When Inanna steals the me from Enki in one famous narrative, she loads them onto her boat and flees to Uruk before Enki realizes what's happened. The story reads like espionage or theft of proprietary technologies, one faction of refugees acquiring capabilities previously monopolized by another. The me's portability and the conflicts surrounding their control suggest they represented actual physical objects, possibly data storage devices or operational manuals, knowledge systems essential for maintaining refugee civilization. Material choices in temple construction reveal sophisticated understanding of physics and engineering. The ziggurat at Ur used approximately 720,000 baked bricks in its core structure, but the outer layer consisted of different brick types with varying porosity and thermal properties, creating insulation that maintained relatively stable interior temperatures despite extreme external fluctuations. This isn't accidental but deliberate thermal engineering, building design that served functional purposes beyond aesthetics or symbolism. Acoustic properties of temple chambers suggest they might have functioned as communication facilities or data processing centers. Certain rooms at Nippur and Ur produce resonance effects at specific frequencies, amplifying particular tones while dampening others, creating spaces where quiet conversations could be clearly heard across distances or where subtle vibrations might register that would be lost in normal environments. These acoustic characteristics seem too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting intentional design for purposes we can only guess at. The obsessive record-keeping that characterizes Mesopotamian civilization from its earliest phases might reflect refugee populations' need to preserve knowledge that existed only in limited copies, vulnerable formats. Temple archives contained hundreds of thousands of tablets documenting everything from astronomical observations to mathematical calculations to mythological narratives, redundant storage systems, ensuring essential information survived even if individual archives were destroyed. Water management throughout Sumerian cities shows engineering sophistication that seems anachronistic for Bronze Age technology. The canal systems required precise gradient calculations, flow rate management, and drainage engineering to prevent flooding, while ensuring adequate irrigation. Some canals incorporated what appear to be primitive locks or flow control gates, allowing water levels to be adjusted based on seasonal variations or strategic needs like flooding approaches to slow attackers. Perhaps the most fascinating architectural mystery involves the temple orientations. Major structures align with astronomical phenomena, with precision measured in fractions of degrees, accuracy requiring either sophisticated surveying equipment or extended observation periods to achieve. Mainstream scholarship attributes these alignments to religious significance. Temples oriented towards solstice sunrises or stellar risings associated with particular deities, but the consistency and precision suggest navigational or communication purposes, structures positioned to sight along specific celestial coordinates for reasons beyond worship. Imagine being part of a small refugee population living among millions of indigenous humans, maintaining technologies that must remain hidden while providing enough benefit to justify your presence and ensure continued acceptance. Every structure you build serves multiple purposes. Religious facade concealing defensive installations, temples that function as fortresses, astronomical observatories that watch for approaching threats, while appearing to track purely calendrical phenomena. You hide in plain sight, your true capabilities and origins obscured within the civilization you've helped create. The ruins that remain, eroded mounds scattered across Iraq and Syria, preserve only fragments of what once existed, but those fragments hint at planning and purpose beyond what conventional archaeological interpretation recognizes, defensive infrastructure and hidden capabilities that make sense for refugee population maintaining vigilant watch for whatever cosmic catastrophe had driven them to establish sanctuary on this remote planet they desperately hoped would prove safe enough for survival, but couldn't entirely trust, building redundant protections while hiding their true nature within the indigenous civilization they'd elevated to provide both camouflage and early warning. If the threats they'd fled ever followed them to Earth, Mesopotamian astronomy wasn't simply calendar making or astrology. The obsessive precision with which priests tracked celestial movements, the redundant record-keeping across multiple temple archives, and the specialized terminology for unusual phenomena suggest something beyond religious observation. The mul.apn tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE, but preserving observations stretching back centuries earlier, document star risings and settings with accuracy to within 1 degree of arc, remarkable for naked eye observation. The tablets distinguish between expected and unexpected celestial events, using specific terminology that reveals underlying anxiety. Regular phenomena like planetary movements and lunar phases receive straightforward descriptive language, but unusual events, lights that appear where none should be, stars that move in wrong directions, or brightness variations that violate predicted patterns, trigger different vocabulary, words suggesting alarm rather than mere documentation. Ziggurat observatories positioned across Mesopotamian cities created network, allowing triangulation of celestial positions from multiple locations. Uruk, Ua, Nippur, and Eridu all maintained astronomical observation programs, with tablets recording simultaneous sightings of specific events. This coordination suggests they were tracking objects with precision requiring multiple viewing angles, measuring distances or velocities that single-point observation couldn't determine. Perhaps most revealing is what they watched for with such intensity. Venus received disproportionate attention, tracked through every phase of her 584-day synodic cycle, with observations recorded across generations. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa document 21 years of continuous observation during the 17th century BCE, noting appearances, disappearances, and deviations from predicted positions. This level of attention makes sense if Venus represented more than astronomical body or divine manifestation, if she marked direction from which threats might approach. The night sky 5,000 years ago appeared dramatically different from our modern light-polluted view. Stars visible to the naked eye numbered in the thousands. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens as luminous band, and planets shone with intensity we can barely imagine. In this pristine darkness, any unusual light would have been immediately apparent, any movement against the fixed stellar background instantly recognizable. The ziggurat watchers maintained their vigil in conditions ideal for detecting approaching objects long before they posed immediate danger. Underground chambers beneath observatories contained what archaeologists interpret as storage for astronomical instruments and tablets, but the chamber's design suggests other purposes, with walls lined in copper sheets approximately 2 millimeters thick and ceilings constructed from specific types of limestone. These material choices create electromagnetic shielding, spaces where sensitive equipment would be protected from atmospheric electrical phenomena. Whether the Anunnaki possess such equipment remains speculation, but the construction suggests they designed these chambers for purposes beyond simple storage. The Saros cycle governing eclipses, an 18.6-year period after which lunar and solar eclipses repeat in similar patterns, was known to Mesopotamian astronomers by at least 2000 BCE. This knowledge required multi-generational observation programs, tracking eclipses across decades, and recognizing patterns that emerge only through patient accumulation of data. The dedication to such long-term projects suggests they were watching for phenomena that might manifest across similarly extended timescales. Certain star catalogues include objects we can no longer identify. The mul.apn tablets list celestial features that don't correspond to any visible stars, nebulae, or planetary positions observable from ancient Mesopotamia. Mainstream astronomy treats these as observational errors, misidentifications, or poetic exaggerations. Alternative researchers wonder whether they documented transient phenomena, objects that were visible 3,000 years ago but have since moved beyond observation range or ceased to be visible. The texts describe gods watching the heavens without sleep, maintaining constant vigil through night hours when most human activity ceased. This phrase appears across multiple compositions, suggesting it represented actual practice rather than metaphorical devotion. Refugee populations maintaining watch for pursuit would organize shifts ensuring continuous observation, never allowing sky to go unwatched during vulnerable darkness hours. What were they watching for? The texts remain ambiguous, describing divine concerns without specifying exact threats. Omen literature treats unusual celestial events as communications from gods, messages requiring priestly interpretation before meaning becomes clear. But beneath theological language lies pattern of vigilance, defensive awareness, systematic monitoring of cosmic environment for signs that whatever the Anunnaki had fled might be approaching Earth. Modern satellite tracking and space surveillance operate on similar principles, watching for objects that might pose threats or reveal approaching dangers. We maintain our watch using electronic systems, but the underlying logic remains unchanged from ziggurat astronomy. Scan the heavens systematically, track anything unusual, maintain records allowing pattern recognition, and prepare responses if threats manifest. The stars the Anunnaki watched still shine, following the same paths they traced when refugee priests climbed stone stairs at sunset to begin their nightly vigil. Whether they were watching for divine messages, tracking purely astronomical phenomena for calendrical purposes, or maintaining defensive awareness against cosmic catastrophe that had driven them to Earth, their observations established foundations for astronomy that continue informing how we understand celestial mechanics, mapping the same sky they mapped with the same fundamental question, underlying all such watching: what approaches from the darkness, and will we see it in time to respond? The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's battle against Tiamat with specificity that seems excessive for pure mythology. He creates 7 winds, each named and assigned specific tactical roles. He fashions a net from the 4 cardinal winds, binding cosmic forces into physical weapons. His primary armament includes bow and arrows, a mace, lightning that dances before him, and a flood weapon that remains somewhat unclear in translation, but appears to manipulate water on massive scale. These aren't the weapons of omnipotent deity who could simply will enemies into non-existence. They're the arsenal of being operating within physical constraints, using technologies and forces that exist in nature but require sophisticated knowledge to control and deploy. The level of detail suggests the account might preserve memory of actual conflict, using advanced capabilities that ancient scribes described through vocabulary available to Bronze Age culture. Tiamat's own forces receive similar detailed treatment. She creates 11 types of monsters, each described with specific characteristics and capabilities: the viper, the dragon, the mad dog, the scorpion man, and 7 others form an army that texts portray as genuinely threatening to younger gods. These beings possess physical forms, occupy space, and can be defeated through force rather than merely dismissed through divine command. The battle itself unfolds through stages recognizable as tactical engagement. Marduk approaches, Tiamat opens her jaws to swallow him, and he drives the evil wind into her mouth, inflating her body from within until she can't close her jaws. He then shoots an arrow that travels down her throat and splits her heart. This sequence describes physical combat using actual physics, even if the scale and context transcend normal experience. After victory, Marduk doesn't simply claim triumph, but performs what sounds like engineering project. He splits Tiamat's corpse, using half to create the vault of heaven and half to form earth below. From her eyes flow the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, from her tail and udder come mountains and springs, from her scattered parts emerge the mechanisms of weather and celestial movements. This description reads less like divine magic and more like terraforming, using available materials to construct habitable environment. Perhaps the war in heaven wasn't mythological allegory, but actual conflict that devastated the Anunnaki's original home, forcing survivors to flee and establish themselves elsewhere. If Tiamat represented rival faction or invasive force that destroyed their previous world, the battle Marduk won might have been final defensive action, allowing evacuation rather than conquest, establishing dominance. The creation of Earth from Tiamat's body could describe refugees adapting a new planet, making it habitable through technologies that manipulated planetary conditions. Alternative interpretations read these texts as preserving memory of cosmic catastrophe witnessed and survived. Graham Hancock's work exploring potential comet impacts during the Younger Dryas period around 12,900 years ago suggests civilizations might have witnessed and recorded astronomical disasters. If the Anunnaki observed similar events, possibly the fragmentation of a planet or massive bombardment of their original home, they might describe it through language of divine warfare, the only framework their culture possessed for expressing violence on planetary scales. The reference to Tiamat creating monsters specifically designed to fight younger gods suggests biological or technological warfare, adversary deploying specialized forces to counter known capabilities. This level of strategic thinking indicates conflict between entities possessing comparable power, not gods confronting mortals, but roughly equivalent forces deploying different advantages in existential struggle. Kingu, Tiamat's champion who leads her forces, possesses the Tablet of Destinies, an artifact that grants authority to determine fate and issue commands that must be obeyed. After Tiamat's defeat, Marduk takes this tablet, confirming his authority over cosmic order. The tablet's transferability suggests it's a physical object rather than abstract authority, possibly technological artifact that provides access to control systems or communication networks essential for maintaining civilization. The gods' fear during these conflicts reveals vulnerability inconsistent with omnipotent deity archetypes. They gather in council debating strategy. They experience genuine terror facing Tiamat's forces, and they desperately seek champion, brave enough to confront the threat. These emotional responses make sense for refugee population facing existential danger, but seem inappropriate for supernatural beings operating beyond physical constraints. silence follows victory in ways that seem ominous rather than peaceful. After Marduk defeats Tiamat, after the cosmos is organized and Earth established, the texts describe settlement into new order, where previous conflicts are remembered but not repeated. This resembles aftermath of devastating war, survivors maintaining peace through mutual exhaustion rather than genuine resolution of underlying tensions. Hidden within the mythological framework of creation through violence lies possible historical memory of actual catastrophe, beings fleeing destroyed world and establishing themselves on new planet through necessity rather than choice. Whether we read these texts as theology, as distorted history, or as sophisticated allegory encoding truths about cosmic violence and civilization's fragility, they preserve consistent pattern of conflict, flight, and establishment of refuge, far from the catastrophic violence that destroyed previous existence. The stars that witnessed these supposed battles, if they occurred, continue their movements unchanged, patient observers of cosmic violence on scales we struggle to comprehend. Whether gods actually fought wars in heaven, or whether ancient scribes created powerful mythology to explain natural disasters and civilization's origins, the texts describing those conflicts remain, pressed into clay tablets that survived millennia to reach us, asking whether we're willing to consider they might preserve genuine memory beneath theological language, refugees recording the catastrophe they'd survived in the only vocabulary their adopted culture possessed. Beneath the temple at Eridu, 6 meters below the platform that supported successive shrines across 2 millennia, excavators in the 1940s discovered chambers that defied easy explanation. The rooms, carved into bedrock and lined with baked brick, maintained constant temperature of approximately 18 degrees Celsius, despite surface temperatures fluctuating between 5 degrees Celsius in winter and 45 degrees Celsius in summer. This thermal stability required sophisticated understanding of insulation, heat capacity, and earth coupling beyond what we typically attribute to Bronze Age engineering. The chamber walls incorporated copper sheets embedded between brick layers at regular intervals of 40 centimeters, creating what modern engineers recognize as electromagnetic shielding. Copper, with electrical conductivity of 5.96 × 10 circumflex 7 Siemens per meter, effectively blocks radio frequencies and electrical fields when properly configured. Why would Bronze Age architects incorporate such shielding into underground chambers supposedly used for grain storage or ritual purposes? Acoustic properties throughout the Akur temple complex at Nippur reveal intentional design for sound manipulation. Certain corridors amplify frequencies between 40 and 60 Hz, while dampening higher frequencies, creating spaces where low tones resonate, while normal conversation becomes muted and indistinct. These same frequency ranges produce infrasound effects in humans, inducing feelings of awe, fear, or religious transcendence depending on exposure duration and intensity. The layout of temple complexes follows geometric patterns that suggest purposes beyond religious symbolism. At Uruk, the Unna complex dedicated to Anunna consists of multiple buildings positioned at specific angles and distances, creating sightlines that align with stellar positions at particular times of year. The central courtyard measures 47 by 33 meters, a ratio of approximately 1.42, close to the square root of 2, a mathematical constant suggesting deliberate geometric planning. Underground passages connecting different sections of major temple complexes create networks that archaeologists have only partially mapped. At ground-penetrating radar reveals tunnels extending at least 200 meters beyond excavated areas, connecting the ziggurat complex to structures whose foundations remain buried beneath accumulated sediment. These passages incorporate ventilation shafts rising to the surface at regular 15-meter intervals, maintaining air circulation through sophisticated engineering that seems anachronistic for the period. Perhaps the most enigmatic architectural features are the circular depressions found in stone floors at multiple sites. These shallow bowls, typically 30 to 40 centimeters in diameter and 8 to 10 centimeters deep, show wear patterns suggesting repeated use of specific implements or objects. Some contain residue of materials including copper compounds, sulfur, and carbon in combinations that don't match normal ritual offerings or domestic activities. Alternative researchers speculate these might represent chemical processing facilities, small-scale manufacturing sites for materials requiring specific treatments. The precision of megalithic stonework in certain temple foundations exceeds capabilities we confidently attribute to Bronze Age technology. At Lagash, foundation stones measuring 2 by 1.5 by 0.8 meters fit together with gaps measured in millimeters, requiring either sophisticated cutting tools or extraordinarily patient hand grinding with abrasives. The surface finish shows smoothness, comparable to modern machine tooling, yet conventional archaeology dates these structures to approximately 2500 BCE, when available tools were copper and bronze implements incapable of such precision on hard limestone. Orientation of major structures demonstrates astronomical knowledge requiring either advanced mathematical capabilities or extended observation programs. The ziggurat at aligns to cardinal directions within 0.75 degrees of accuracy, precision demanding either sophisticated surveying equipment or years of stellar tracking to achieve. The main axis of the structure points 3.2 degrees east of true north, an offset that some researchers argue compensates for precession, aligning the structure to north celestial pole position as it was in 3800 BCE, rather than when the ziggurat was actually built around 2100 BCE. Hidden chambers revealed through modern scanning technologies continue emerging from supposedly well-studied sites. Ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity surveys at Nipper in 2019 identified previously unknown void spaces beneath the Eckers Foundation platform, rectangular chambers measuring approximately 4 by 6 meters that remain unexcavated due to structural concerns about removing overlying material. What these chambers contain, why they were sealed, and what purposes they served remain unknown. The symbolism carved into stone surfaces throughout Mesopotamian architecture contains layers of meaning that shift depending on which interpretive framework you apply. Traditional scholarship reads religious iconography, gods and their symbols, mythological narratives rendered in visual form. Alternative interpretation sees technical diagrams, schematic representations of technologies or processes that ancient artists recorded using available artistic conventions. Cylinder seals, those small carved stones that functioned as signatures and identity markers, sometimes depict scenes that resist easy mythological explanation. The famous VA 243 seal in Berlin's Vorderasiatisches Museum shows what Zechariah Sitchin argued represents solar system, with 12 bodies, though mainstream scholarship dismisses this as misidentification of decorative star symbols. The debate continues, with both sides marshalling evidence, but neither achieving consensus. What secrets remain hidden beneath unexcavated portions of ancient sites? How much has been lost to erosion, looting, and the simple passage of time? Approximately 90% of Mesopotamian archaeological sites remain unexcavated, their contents unknown, their potential to confirm or challenge existing theories unrealized. Every year brings new scanning technologies, better methods for analyzing materials and structures without destruction, and occasionally discoveries that force revision of what we thought we understood. The silence beneath these ancient structures holds memory we can only partially access. Stone and brick wait patiently, preserving whatever truths they witnessed, neither confirming nor denying the theories we project onto them. Whether they hide evidence of refugee technologies, defensive installations disguised as temples, or simply represent remarkable human achievement within limitations of Bronze Age capabilities, they remain, scattered across landscapes that have changed remarkably little across 4 millennia, asking whether we possess sufficient humility to acknowledge that ancient peoples might have known and done things we haven't yet recognized, built structures whose purposes transcend the religious and symbolic interpretations we've comfortably assigned to them. Academic consensus treats the Anunnaki as mythological constructs, sophisticated theological concepts that ancient Mesopotamians developed to explain cosmic order, natural phenomena, and social hierarchies, rather than historical documentation of actual beings arriving on or escaping to Earth. This interpretation dominates peer-reviewed scholarship, taught in universities, and published in archaeological journals that establish professional understanding of ancient texts. Scholars point to clear patterns of mythological development across Mesopotamian history. The earliest Sumerian texts from around 3200 BCE show simple god lists and brief religious formulas, gradually evolving into complex narratives by 2500 BCE as writing systems matured and literary traditions developed. This progression suggests humans creating increasingly elaborate stories rather than preserving memories of actual events, mythological sophistication emerging alongside cultural complexity. Thorkild Jacobson's influential work in the mid-20th century argued that Mesopotamian religion represented sophisticated philosophical system, using personified natural forces to explain how the universe functions. And the sky god embodies celestial realm. Enlil, the storm god, represents atmospheric phenomena. Enki, the water god, manifests in rivers and marshes. The Anunnaki serve administrative functions within this cosmic bureaucracy, divine middle management, maintaining order according to principles the great gods establish. Samuel Noah Kramer emphasized that Sumerian literature demonstrates remarkable intellectual achievement without requiring extraterrestrial intervention or refugee scenarios. Humans developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, and complex social organizations through their own capabilities, solving problems through observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed across generations. The sudden appearance of civilization around 3500 BCE actually followed millennia of gradual development during the Ubaid period, visible in archaeological sequences showing pottery evolution, architectural improvement, and increasing settlement complexity. Linguistic analysis by mainstream Assyriologists interprets the terminology we've examined through cultural and literary contexts, rather than literal meaning. When texts use verbs suggesting flight or refuge seeking, scholars argue these represent poetic variation, stylistic choices, or theological nuances about how divinity relates to earthly realm. The Sumerian and Akkadian languages employed rich vocabulary, allowing scribes to describe similar concepts with different emphases without intending literal distinctions. Modern interpreters might imagine. Jeremy Black's work on Sumerian literature emphasized that we must resist imposing our expectations onto ancient texts. The scribes wrote for contemporary audiences within specific cultural frameworks, not to preserve information for distant future generations with radically different worldviews. Reading refugee narratives into creation myths projects modern concerns about displacement and climate change onto texts that served entirely different functions within Bronze Age society. Perhaps the strongest argument against literal interpretation comes from comparative mythology. Flood narratives appear in cultures worldwide, from ancient Greece to indigenous America to South Asia, yet we don't assume they all preserve memories of actual global deluge. Divine descent from heaven appears in Egyptian, Greek, Norse, and countless other mythological systems, suggesting this represents common human pattern for conceptualizing sacred origins, rather than multiple independent records of actual extraterrestrial arrivals. Archaeological evidence shows no technological discontinuities, suggesting external intervention. Pottery styles evolve gradually, metallurgical techniques develop through experimentation, architectural capabilities improve incrementally. When innovations appear, they show clear developmental sequences rather than sudden introductions of fully formed technologies. The ziggurat architecture that seems so sophisticated actually emerged from simpler platform temples built centuries earlier, each generation adding height and complexity to structures their ancestors began. We may never recover ancient Mesopotamians' actual beliefs about their gods with certainty. Did they conceive the Anunnaki as literally real beings dwelling in temples, or did they understand mythological narratives as sophisticated metaphors for natural and social forces? The question might be unanswerable, because religious consciousness often operates simultaneously on multiple levels, treating stories as both literally meaningful and symbolically true without experiencing contradiction. What we can say confidently is that Mesopotamian texts represent human achievement deserving respect and study, regardless of whether they preserve historical memory or constitute pure mythology. The astronomical observations were genuine, conducted with remarkable precision, and systematically recorded across centuries. The engineering was sophisticated, creating structures that functioned effectively for their purposes. The literature displays philosophical depth, grappling with fundamental questions about suffering, mortality, cosmic order, and human purpose that remain relevant today. The refugee interpretation, from mainstream scholarly perspective, represents interesting thought experiment, but lacks supporting evidence, meeting standards of academic rigor. Extraordinary claims about extraterrestrial beings or advanced lost civilizations require extraordinary evidence, and linguistic ambiguities or architectural mysteries don't meet that threshold. The simpler explanation that humans created these texts and structures through their own remarkable capabilities remains more parsimonious until compelling evidence demands revision. This doesn't diminish the text's importance or reduce them to primitive superstition. Mesopotamian mythology represents sophisticated intellectual work, complex theological thinking, and powerful literature addressing universal human concerns. Whether the Anunnaki were refugees fleeing cosmic catastrophe or mythological constructs explaining cosmic order, the texts preserving their stories deserve careful study, respectful interpretation, and acknowledgement that they reveal profound insights about how humans have always tried to understand our place in a vast and often incomprehensible universe. Some researchers approach these texts with different foundational assumptions, asking whether ancient scribes might have been attempting to record actual events using the only conceptual vocabulary and literary conventions available within their culture. If beings from elsewhere did establish themselves on Earth during the period when Sumerian civilization emerged, the texts describing divine descent or escape would preserve genuine historical memory, translated through theological language. Zecharia Sitchin's controversial work Beginning with the 12th Planet in 1976 proposed that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, following a long elliptical orbit through our solar system. While mainstream scholars rejected his linguistic interpretations and astronomical claims, his core insight that these texts might describe actual beings rather than pure mythology resonated with millions of readers seeking alternative frameworks for understanding ancient history. The refugee interpretation offers variation on ancient astronaut theory that addresses some logical problems with colonization narratives. If the Anunnaki came to mine gold or exploit Earth's resources, why integrate so thoroughly with indigenous populations? Why share knowledge and elevate human capabilities rather than maintaining strict separation? But if they were refugees seeking to hide within human civilization, these choices make strategic sense, blending in and creating camouflage rather than dominating openly. Graham Hancock's work exploring potential lost civilizations before the end of the last ice age provides middle ground between mainstream archaeology and extraterrestrial theories. Perhaps advanced human societies existed 12,000 years ago, achieving sophisticated astronomical knowledge and architectural capabilities before being destroyed by cataclysms that geological evidence documents. Survivors could have migrated to various regions including Mesopotamia, appearing as culture heroes or gods to less developed peoples, while actually representing remnants of human civilization that predated currently accepted chronologies. This hypothesis doesn't require extraterrestrial contact, but does challenge conventional archaeological dating and cultural development models. The gods who established Sumerian civilization might have been descendants of these earlier advanced humans, maintaining knowledge and technologies inherited from antediluvian societies, eventually losing their distinct identity through intermarriage and cultural integration, but leaving textual and architectural evidence that something extraordinary occurred during humanity's supposed transition from hunter-gatherers to urban civilization. Alternative researchers point to cross-cultural patterns suggesting ancient contact or shared origin. Flood narratives appear worldwide with striking similarities in detail. Pyramid-building civilizations emerged independently on different continents. Astronomical knowledge appears in cultures that supposedly had no contact, all tracking similar celestial phenomena with comparable precision. Perhaps these patterns indicate common source, refugees from catastrophe spreading across the globe and establishing multiple centers of civilization that preserved shared knowledge through different cultural expressions. The problem with alternative interpretations remains evidentiary burden. Mainstream scholars rightly demand physical evidence meeting archaeological standards, not just linguistic ambiguities or architectural anomalies. Where are the artifacts demonstrably beyond Bronze Age manufacturing capabilities? Where are the genetic markers indicating non-human or advanced human admixture? Where are the unambiguous textual statements that couldn't be explained through conventional mythology? Alternative researchers counter that we haven't looked properly, that conventional archaeology dismisses evidence not fitting established paradigms, and that sophisticated refugees would deliberately avoid leaving obvious traces that might attract the attention of whatever they fled. This argument has merit but also risks becoming unfalsifiable, explaining away lack of evidence as proof of successful concealment. Perhaps both interpretations capture partial truths. The text preserves some genuine historical memory of actual events during Mesopotamian civilization's emergence, but that memory has been thoroughly transformed through generations of retelling, theological reinterpretation, and literary elaboration. Refugees might have come to Earth, or advanced humans might have survived earlier catastrophes, or purely indigenous development might have occurred with more sophistication than we credit. Distinguishing between these possibilities, from evidence surviving 5,000 years, grows increasingly difficult as time erases details. We may never achieve certainty about what the Sumerian texts actually describe. The linguistic evidence permits multiple readings, the archaeological remains support various interpretations, and the core questions about Anunnaki origins remain genuinely unresolved. Mainstream scholarship offers coherent explanation requiring no extraordinary assumptions, but potentially missing evidence of actual extraordinary events. Alternative theories explain curious details, mainstream interpretation struggles with but rely on speculations, difficult to verify or falsify. What if the value lies not in resolving the debate, but in maintaining openness to multiple possibilities? The mystery itself serves functions that premature certainty would eliminate. It keeps us humble before evidence we can't fully interpret, prevents scholarly dogmatism that dismisses uncomfortable data, and preserves space for future discoveries that might vindicate perspectives currently considered fringe or reveal entirely new frameworks we haven't yet imagined. The stars the Anunnaki supposedly watched, whether as gods or refugees or mythological projections of human consciousness, continue their ancient movements unchanged. They witnessed whatever actually occurred when Sumerian civilization emerged from the marshlands between two rivers, and they maintain their silence. neither confirming nor denying the theories we construct to explain texts and ruins that preserve only fragments of what ancient people knew, believed, or experienced during those distant millennia when writing began, and history, such as we can reconstruct it, first became possible to record. The memory survived because fear is memorable. Mesopotamian scribes copied and recopied texts describing divine arrival on Earth across more than 2,000 years, from the earliest Sumerian compositions around 2500 BCE through late Babylonian versions dating to 500 BCE. This represents one of the longest continuous textual traditions in human history, suggesting the narratives held significance beyond typical mythology, preserving something communities felt compelled to remember across dozens of generations. When cuneiform writing fell out of use around 100 CE, the text became unreadable. The cities dissolved into tells, low mounds scattered across Iraq and Syria where wind and rain gradually buried the architectural remains beneath accumulated sediment. For 1,700 years, the Anunnaki existed only as dim echoes in biblical and classical sources that no longer remembered their Mesopotamian origins or the specific details about how and why they came to Earth. The rediscovery began in the 1840s with Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nineveh, though the full implications wouldn't emerge for more than a century. His team shipped approximately 25,000 clay tablet fragments to the British Museum between 1845 and 1851, creating backlog that would take generations of scholars to fully translate and interpret. George Smith's 1872 discovery of the flood narrative sparked initial excitement, but the refugee interpretation of Anunnaki arrival required linguistic analysis that wouldn't be possible until comprehensive databases allowed tracking specific terms across thousands of texts. Even now, new tablets continue emerging from museum storage. The British Museum holds roughly 130,000 cuneiform tablets, with significant portions catalogued but not fully published or translated. Each year brings revised editions of familiar texts, new fragments joining previously known pieces, and occasionally entirely unknown compositions revealing details that confirm or complicate existing theories. A tablet published in 2017 from the University of Pennsylvania's collection contains previously unknown version of the Eridu Genesis, with variant readings of key passages describing the Anunnakis coming to Earth. Modern computational linguistics has enabled analysis impossible for earlier scholars. Digital databases containing hundreds of thousands of cuneiform texts allow researchers to track how specific Sumerian and Akkadian terms are used across different contexts, revealing patterns of meaning that escape notice when examining individual tablets in isolation. This technology produced the linguistic observations, suggesting flight and refuge terminology that traditional scholarship rendered as simple descent from heaven. Still today, archaeological work continues at Mesopotamian sites despite political instability affecting the region. Iraqi archaeologists working at Ur in 2019 discovered previously unknown temple archives in chambers sealed during the site's final occupation phases around 400 BCE. The tablets, approximately 340 in total, await full translation, but preliminary examination suggests they contain astronomical records and ritual texts that might clarify how late Babylonian priests understood the Anunnaki's origins. The refugee interpretation resonates with contemporary concerns in ways that pure colonization narratives don't. We live in an era of unprecedented human displacement, with climate change forcing populations to flee rising seas and failing agriculture, with political violence creating refugee crises affecting millions. Reading ancient texts through the lens of escape and sanctuary connects their stories to our immediate reality, making Bronze Age narratives feel suddenly urgent and relevant. Perhaps this is why the alternative interpretation has gained traction outside academic circles, even while mainstream scholarship remains skeptical. When gods appear as powerful colonizers descending to exploit primitive Earth, they remain distant and alien. But when gods appear as vulnerable refugees fleeing cosmic catastrophe and desperately seeking safety, they become relatable, their experiences mirroring human struggles across all eras including our own. Cross-cultural patterns of divine arrival stories take on different meaning when examined through refugee frameworks. Why do so many ancient mythologies describe gods coming from elsewhere, establishing themselves among humans, sharing knowledge while also maintaining distinct identity? Standard interpretation treats these as independent developments, humans everywhere, creating similar stories to explain civilization's origins. But what if they preserve fragmented memories of actual migration events, whether extraterrestrial refugees or survivors of earlier human civilizations spreading across the globe after catastrophes destroyed their original homes? The obsessive skywatching that characterized Mesopotamian astronomy and appears in cultures worldwide might reflect genuine vigilance rather than pure religious devotion, If ancient peoples actually witnessed cosmic catastrophes, whether natural disasters or conflicts involving advanced technologies, they might maintain defensive awareness watching for recurrence. The stars would represent not just calendar and omen, but potential threat, distance that provided temporary safety, but could eventually be crossed by whatever forces had destroyed previous worlds. We may never know with certainty whether the Anunnaki were mythological constructs, extraterrestrial refugees, or survivors of lost human civilizations. The evidence permits multiple interpretations, and new discoveries might vindicate perspectives currently considered fringe or reveal entirely different frameworks we haven't yet imagined. What remains clear is that these ancient texts preserve something powerful enough to maintain relevance across 5,000 years, questions about origins and vulnerability, and the search for sanctuary that every human generation encounters in their own way. The stars that supposedly witnessed the Anunnaki's arrival or escape still wheel overhead, following the same paths they traced when Sumerian astronomers first began recording their movements. Those celestial patterns connect us directly to ancient observers, the same Venus rising and setting, the same moon measuring months, the same constellations marking seasons and years. Whether gods actually watched those stars, or whether the entire narrative represents sophisticated human mythology, the continuity remains, time measured in stellar movements that neither gods nor humans nor geological processes can alter. Still today, refugees flee catastrophe, seeking sanctuary in remote locations that might offer safety. Climate change forces populations to abandon coastal regions and drought-stricken agricultural lands. Political violence displaces millions who gather whatever they can carry and search desperately for anywhere willing to accept them. The pattern repeats because the underlying dynamics remain constant, beings fleeing threats they can't control, seeking refuge wherever safety might be found, hoping distance will protect them from whatever catastrophe destroyed the worlds they'd known. And the story continues in us, the listeners, lying here in darkness, asking whether ancient texts might preserve truths about vulnerability that transcend whatever specific historical events they describe. Whether the Anunnaki were gods or refugees or mythological projections of human consciousness, their narratives speak to universal experiences of displacement, fear, and the desperate search for sanctuary that defines what it means to flee from catastrophe, hoping somewhere, somehow, safety might still be possible to find. Come back now to where you are. The room around you, quiet and dim, your breathing, slow and natural, the rhythm that's carried you through these hours exploring questions about arrival and escape, descent and flight, gods and refugees, the weight of your body against whatever surface holds you, solid and present. The ancient voices we've been listening to have returned to their clay tablets, settled back into museum archives and archaeological storage, back into the patient silence they maintained for millennia before we disturbed them with our translations and competing interpretations. The ruins still stand in Iraq, low mounds rising barely visible above the desert floor where cities once sprawled across irrigated plains. Eridu, where the texts claim kingship first descended, or where refugees first established sanctuary, remains mostly unexcavated, its deepest layers holding whatever truths they witnessed about how civilization began in that remote marshland between two rivers. The ziggurat platforms that served as astronomical observatories have eroded to their foundations, stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of priestly feet climbing to watch the night sky with attention that might have been devotion or vigilance or both. We've asked many questions tonight about whether the Anunnaki descended from heaven as powerful gods choosing to visit Earth, or escaped from cosmic catastrophe as desperate refugees seeking any safe harbor they could find. We've examined linguistic evidence suggesting flight, architectural details hinting at defensive purposes, and astronomical obsession that might reflect vigilance against pursuing threats. Some mysteries we've illuminated, tracing how language preserves multiple meanings and how translation choices shape interpretation. Other mysteries remain exactly as mysterious as when we began, questions about divine origins and cosmic catastrophe that might never be answered with certainty, regardless of how many tablets we translate or how thoroughly we excavate ancient sites. Perhaps we're not meant to know for certain what happened when Sumerian civilization emerged 5,000 years ago. The evidence permits multiple readings, the texts preserve ambiguities that translation can't fully resolve, and the core questions about whether gods were refugees remain genuinely open. Mainstream scholarship offers coherent explanations requiring no extraordinary assumptions, while alternative interpretations address curious details that conventional frameworks struggle to accommodate. Both perspectives capture aspects of truth while missing elements we might never access, and the gap between what we can know and what we want to understand may be a permanent feature of working with evidence, separated from us by such vast temporal distances. The stars continue their movements, following paths established billions of years ago when stellar systems formed from collapsing gas clouds. Venus still rises as morning star and sets as evening star in her eternal 584-day cycle, the same pattern Mesopotamian astronomers tracked when gods supposedly dwelt in earthly temples or maintained refugee settlements hidden within human civilization. The moon still measures months through phases that Sumerian calendars synchronize with solar years, creating time systems we inherited directly from their patient observations. Those celestial patterns witnessed whatever actually occurred during those distant millennia when the Anunnaki established presence on Earth, and they maintain their silence, revealing nothing, confirming nothing, simply continuing their ancient dance while questions persist below about origins and arrivals and the possibility that beings far from home once sought sanctuary on this remote planet. If gods fled to Earth, they're still hiding. If they were mythological constructs, they're still powerful. If they represented advanced humans surviving earlier catastrophes, their descendants have forgotten, or their knowledge dissolved back into the archaeological record. We're still slowly recovering. The mystery endures, because perhaps mystery serves essential purposes, keeping us humble before evidence we can't fully interpret, preventing premature certainty about matters where certainty might be impossible, preserving space for wonder in an age that too often demands definitive answers to questions that may not have them. Wind moves across the Iraqi desert, carrying sand and silence, wearing down what little remains of walls that once enclosed millions of lives and thousands of years of accumulated history. Rain falls occasionally, rare but welcome, temporarily transforming dust into brief green growth before heat returns and desert reasserts itself. The Euphrates still flows, though in altered channels and diminished volume, connecting past to present through simple persistence, water following gravity as it always has. And somewhere beneath that wind and rain and flowing water, beneath accumulated sediment and the weight of deep time, clay tablets wait in patient stillness, their wedge-shaped marks still legible after 5 millennia, still capable of speaking if someone takes the trouble to read them, telling again how the Anunnaki came to Earth or fled to Earth or were imagined into existence by Bronze Age minds grappling with questions about where we came from and why we're here, and whether the forces that shape our existence care about our survival or simply operate according to cosmic patterns, indifferent to human hopes and fears, the questions persisting because perhaps the asking matters more than the answering, the search more than the finding, the mystery itself serving purposes that resolution would eliminate, keeping us connected across time to ancient peoples who wondered about the same things we wonder about, who watched the same stars we watch, who asked whether being greater than themselves might be watching too, still seeking refuge, still maintaining vigilance, still hoping that whatever catastrophe drove them here, or whatever cosmic violence we imagine drove them here, won't follow them to this last sanctuary, this remote planet, where stone still remembers, and silence still holds, and the questions wait in darkness, patient as the stars that witnessed everything, or witnessed nothing, continuing their ancient movements, while below them, the words pressed into clay, across such vast silence remain, neither confirming nor denying, simply waiting